Welcome to Mafia's audiobook. Here you'll drift into carefully told tales of real-life mobsters, infamous deals, and historic underworld legends, all shared in a calm, non-violent way to help you wind down at night. No jump scares, no gritty drama, just stories to gently carry you to sleep while learning a little history along the way. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin tonight's journey through the softer side of true crime. In 2007, Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika announced an investigation into claims that the Tambov Gang had forcefully seized control over 13 large enterprises across Russia. But the investigation revealed something unexpected about these alleged criminal activities. These weren't traditional street-level operations involving drugs or violence. Prosecutors described sophisticated business networks involving fuel distribution, port logistics, and private security companies. Multiple investigations suggested the gang had achieved something remarkable. They had created a hybrid organization that operated simultaneously in criminal and legitimate spheres. This video will explain how this transformation happened, tracing the measured steps that led from street-level crime to boardroom influence. The story begins not with violence or intimidation, but with an unusual recruitment strategy that started decades earlier in the most unexpected place. In 1987, something unusual was happening in the sports clubs of Leningrad. Young men from the Tambov region were arriving in the city, drawn by opportunities that had nothing to do with athletics. These weren't the typical provincial athletes, seeking glory in Soviet competitions. They came with different intentions, different connections, and a shared understanding that would soon reshape the criminal landscape of Russia's second-largest city. Vladimir Kumarin understood something that other aspiring criminal leaders missed entirely. The key to building a successful organization wasn't just about finding tough men willing to break skulls for money. It was about finding the right kind of tough men. Kumarin and his partner from Tambov Oblast began recruiting fellow athletes and sportsmen from their home region, using shared origins as the foundation for trust. They specifically targeted wrestlers, boxers, and martial artists who had grown up in the same provincial towns, attended the same schools, and learned their fighting skills in the same training halls. Investigators and contemporary reporting later described this recruitment pattern of sportsmen and men from Tambov, a strategy that created bonds far stronger than simple business partnerships. These weren't typical street criminals looking to make quick money through random violence and petty theft. They were organized, physically capable, and had connections that stretched back to their provincial homeland. Each new recruit brought not just his own skills and loyalty, but access to brothers, cousins, and childhood friends who could be trusted in ways that urban strangers never could. The network grew through family ties, sporting connections, and regional pride. The choice of athletes wasn't random or accidental. These men had discipline earned through years of training regimens that most people couldn't endure. They possessed physical strength that came from dedicated conditioning rather than just natural size. Most importantly, they understood teamwork and hierarchy in ways that individual street fighters never learned. In wrestling clubs and boxing gyms across Tambov region, they had absorbed lessons about following orders, supporting teammates, and working toward collective goals. Their provincial origins fostered trust that urban criminals couldn't easily replicate, giving them an edge in a city full of competing factions. When a Tambov native walked into a room with other men from his region, they shared dialects, childhood memories, family connections, and cultural references that outsiders couldn't understand or penetrate. This shared identity made infiltration by rivals or police informants extremely difficult. Urban criminals might betray each other for money or advantage, but men from the same villages had reputations and family honor at stake. The Tambov region connection provided them with a steady stream of new recruits who shared common backgrounds and could be trusted with sensitive operations. When the organization needed additional personnel for protection rackets or territorial disputes, Kumarin could send word back to his home region and receive recommendations for reliable men who had been vouched for by existing members. This recruitment pipeline solved one of the biggest problems facing criminal organizations: finding trustworthy personnel without compromising security. What made this recruitment strategy particularly effective was how it combined rural loyalty with urban opportunity. The athletes brought provincial values of family honor and regional pride that created strong internal bonds, while the city environment offered business opportunities and political connections that their home region could never provide. This combination gave them both the trust necessary for criminal conspiracies and the sophistication needed to operate in complex urban environments. The regional sports network created natural cover for their activities as well. Athletes regularly traveled between cities for competitions, training camps, and tournaments. This mobility provided perfect explanations for frequent trips, late-night meetings, and connections with people in different locations. Law enforcement officers investigating suspicious gatherings often found reasonable explanations involving sporting events or training activities that made surveillance more difficult. As more Tambov origin men joined the group, they began to establish a reputation that would soon catch the attention of both rivals and law enforcement. Other criminal organizations noticed that these provincials operated with unusual discipline and coordination. They didn't engage in the random violence or public displays that often brought unwanted police attention. Instead, they conducted business with professional efficiency that made them both more profitable and more dangerous than typical street gangs. The athletic backgrounds also provided them with legitimate public identities that could be maintained alongside their criminal activities. Many continued participating in sports clubs, coaching younger athletes, or working in fitness-related businesses that provided both income and credibility. This dual existence allowed them to move freely in legitimate society while building their criminal empire in the shadows. This regional sports network became the foundation for what would grow into one of Russia's most sophisticated criminal organizations. The combination of physical capability, provincial loyalty, and athletic discipline created a criminal organization that operated more like a professional military unit than a typical street gang. Their recruitment strategy had solved fundamental problems of trust, capability, and expansion that destroyed many other criminal enterprises. But their athletic backgrounds were just the beginning. They needed a business model that could generate serious money and sustain their growing organization. The timing couldn't have been better, as the Soviet Union was about to undergo changes that would create unprecedented opportunities for those willing to take risks. Saint Petersburg in the late 1980s was a city caught between two worlds. The dying Soviet system still controlled major industries and state enterprises, while an uncertain capitalist future was creating opportunities that existed nowhere in the rulebooks. The old certainties were crumbling faster than new institutions could replace them. Factory managers who had followed state directives for decades suddenly found themselves making independent business decisions. Workers who had depended on guaranteed employment discovered that job security was becoming a memory. Citizens who had accepted that the state would provide everything they needed were learning that survival might require entrepreneurial skills they had never developed. As Gorbachev's reforms loosened state control, legitimate businesses found themselves in a dangerous position. Small cooperatives, private restaurants, and emerging market vendors were operating in legal gray areas where traditional Soviet law enforcement had no clear authority. The police forces that had maintained order under the old system were designed to prevent black market activity and suppress private enterprise. They weren't equipped to protect the very businesses that perestroika was encouraging. Local police stations received conflicting instructions from different government agencies about which activities were legal and which remained criminal. Officers who had spent their careers shutting down private businesses were suddenly expected to protect them. The economic chaos of perestroika created a vacuum where traditional law enforcement was completely overwhelmed. Police departments faced budget cuts as state funding decreased, while crime rates increased as economic desperation grew. Many officers took second jobs as their government salaries became worthless, and investigators struggled with commercial crimes they had never encountered before: business disputes, contract violations, and commercial theft that had been impossible under the centralized Soviet economy. Private business owners discovered that calling the police for help often resulted in nothing more than paperwork that led nowhere. Small businesses became easy targets for criminal extortion. Entrepreneurs who had saved money for years to open restaurants or small shops found themselves facing demands for protection payments within weeks of opening their doors. Market vendors selling goods that had been illegal just months earlier were told that their continued operation depended on regular payments to local criminals. The Tambov athletes understood something that separated them from typical criminal opportunists. This wasn't just about intimidation and collecting tribute from terrified business owners. They recognized that they were providing a service that businesses actually needed in the absence of reliable state protection. When a restaurant owner paid protection money to Tambov, he received actual security services in return. Gang members would intervene if customers refused to pay bills, help resolve disputes with suppliers, and prevent other criminals from targeting the business. This created genuine value for business owners who had no other source of reliable protection. Their approach was notably more professional than many competitors who relied purely on violence and threats. While other criminal groups might smash windows and beat up business owners who couldn't pay, Tambov representatives would sit down with struggling entrepreneurs and work out payment schedules that kept businesses operating. They understood that destroying a business eliminated the source of future income, while helping it succeed created long-term revenue streams. Gang members often provided business advice based on their observations of which enterprises were profitable and which were failing. Some even invested their own money in businesses they were protecting, becoming legitimate partners, as well as criminal protectors. The gang learned that sustainable protection rackets required maintaining good relationships with business owners, rather than simply terrorizing them. They developed reputations for being reliable and fair in their dealings with legitimate entrepreneurs. Business owners who paid their protection fees on time could count on immediate help when they faced problems. Word spread through the business community that Tambov protection was expensive but effective. This reputation allowed them to charge higher rates than competitors while actually reducing the amount of violence required to collect payments. St. Petersburg's unique history provided advantages that other Soviet cities couldn't offer. The city had always been Russia's window to Europe, with centuries of international trade experience that had created business customs different from the rest of the country. Local entrepreneurs were more accustomed to dealing with unofficial arrangements, flexible partnerships, and informal agreements that existed outside official government oversight. Business owners who had grown up in St. Petersburg understood that successful commerce often required relationships that weren't documented in official records. This cultural background made them more willing to work with criminal organizations that could provide services the state couldn't deliver. The port city's international connections also created opportunities for businesses that required protection from more than just local criminals. Import-export operations needed security for warehouses storing foreign goods. Currency exchange operations required protection from both criminals and overzealous government officials. Tourist-related businesses faced unique challenges that traditional Soviet police had never handled. Tambov's growing reputation and professional approach made them the preferred choice for business owners dealing with these complex protection needs. By the mid-1990s, some criminal groups began forming private security enterprises and pursuing legal investments, transforming protection rackets into legitimate business models. The combination of economic uncertainty and entrepreneurial opportunity made St. Petersburg the ideal breeding ground for sophisticated organized crime. The city offered enough legitimate business activity to support professional protection rackets, while government weakness created space for criminal organizations to operate without constant interference. Success in protection rackets would soon attract attention from an unexpected source that would change everything about how the public perceived them. Media attention arrived through Alexander Nevezorov's popular television program 600 Seconds, which began investigating crime in St. Petersburg during the early 1990s. The show's producers believed they were performing a public service by exposing dangerous criminal organizations that were terrorizing local businesses and residents. They sent camera crews into the streets to document protection rackets, interviewed business owners about extortion demands, and compiled detailed reports about gang activities that were affecting daily life in post-Soviet Russia. The investigative team worked for months gathering evidence and testimonies that would reveal the scope of organized crime's influence throughout the city. The investigative show aimed to expose criminal activity and warn the public about dangerous gangs operating throughout St. Petersburg. Producers wanted citizens to understand which neighborhoods had become unsafe, which businesses were under criminal control, and how ordinary people could protect themselves from gang violence. They featured dramatic footage of burned-out storefronts, interviewed victims of extortion, and provided detailed descriptions of criminal methods and territorial boundaries. The show's format included regular segments about different criminal organizations, comparing their methods, territories, and levels of violence. However, coverage on 600 Seconds raised Tambov's profile in ways that nobody could have predicted. Instead of damaging their reputation among potential victims, the television coverage made them publicly known as the most organized and professional criminal group in the city. The show's detailed coverage suggested that Tambov operated with military-like precision and maintained standards that other gangs couldn't match. When the program described their recruitment methods, business practices, and territorial control, viewers heard descriptions of an organization that sounded more like a corporation than a typical criminal gang. The coverage highlighted their discipline, strategic thinking, and ability to maintain long-term business relationships rather than simply engaging in random violence. Media visibility made them more recognizable, and, in a lawless commercial environment, that recognition sometimes translated into perceived credibility among businesses. The television coverage provided detailed information about their business practices, territorial boundaries, and methods of operation that helped business owners understand their options. Coverage made Tambov seem professional, and therefore a more attractive protection option compared to competitors who appeared disorganized or unpredictable. Entrepreneurs who had been considering protection arrangements could compare different organizations based on the information provided by investigative reporters. The media attention created opportunities that helped the gang attract both new recruits and potential clients without spending money on promotion. Young men from Tambov region who might not have known about opportunities in St. Petersburg learned about the organization through television coverage that reached their home communities. The program's detailed descriptions of gang operations provided information that reached potential members across the region. At the same time, business owners throughout the city became aware of Tambov's services and territorial boundaries, allowing them to make informed decisions about protection arrangements. Other criminal groups found themselves at a disadvantage because they lacked the same level of public recognition that television coverage provided. While Tambov received detailed coverage that explained their methods and territories, competing organizations were mentioned only briefly or described in vague terms that made them seem less organized and reliable. The television attention created a situation where one gang received extensive coverage while their competitors remained relatively unknown to the general public. This media imbalance translated into business advantages for Tambov in both recruitment and client relationships. The television coverage also suggested that Tambov had connections and influence that allowed them to operate openly despite investigative scrutiny. The fact that they continued conducting business normally while being featured on television implied that they possessed some form of protection that prevented serious interference with their activities. Viewers reasonably concluded that an organization confident enough to operate publicly during media investigations must have allies who helped them avoid major problems. This perception of connections made them appear even more reliable to business owners who wanted protection that extended beyond simple muscle. What the producers didn't realize was that in an environment where government protection was unreliable, being featured as the most prominent gang was actually advantageous rather than damaging. The program's warnings about gang danger had limited effect in a society where citizens already assumed they needed criminal protection to survive. Instead of encouraging people to avoid gangs entirely, the coverage helped them choose which gang offered the most professional services. In an environment where protection was necessary for business survival, television coverage that highlighted one organization's reliability functioned as useful information for potential clients. The show's detailed analysis of territorial boundaries and business practices also helped establish Tambov's legitimacy among competitors and potential rivals. Other criminal organizations learned from television coverage which areas Tambov controlled and what methods they used to maintain their territories. This public documentation of their operations created recognition that helped prevent conflicts and establish clear boundaries between different gangs. The television coverage functioned as unofficial documentation that helped stabilize relationships within the criminal landscape. The 600 seconds coverage transformed the Tambov Gang from a local protection racket into a recognizable name that carried weight across St. Petersburg. Their television prominence created recognition and credibility that took other criminal organizations years to develop through street-level operations. Business owners, potential recruits, competitors, and law enforcement all learned to think of Tambov as a major criminal organization based largely on media coverage that was intended to expose their activities. This increased visibility raised questions about how they managed to operate so openly, while other gangs faced constant pressure from law enforcement. Their apparent confidence suggested advantages that went beyond simple street-level organization. The source of that confidence lay in allegations that would surface years later through investigations and reporting. Multiple sources claimed that Tambov leaders had cultivated relationships with state security services from the very beginning, creating connections that allegedly extended far beyond the criminal underworld into the shadowy corridors of Soviet power. These relationships weren't accidents or lucky breaks that happened after they became successful. Investigators and journalists would later allege they were carefully constructed alliances that provided the foundation for everything else they would accomplish in the chaotic years that followed. According to various investigations, Vladimir Kumarin and his partner had established connections with KGB operatives as early as the late 1980s, allegedly providing them with protection and intelligence that other criminal groups could never access. These weren't simple corruption arrangements, where gang members paid bribes to individual officers for specific favors. The relationships allegedly involved ongoing cooperation between Tambov leadership and security service personnel who saw advantages in working with organized criminals who could be trusted to maintain operational security. The timing of these connections was crucial because they were established before the gang became prominent, when KGB officers were looking for reliable partners who could help them navigate the uncertain transition away from the Soviet system. Investigative reporting suggested the security service connections weren't limited to low-level operatives looking to supplement their government salaries. Tambov leaders had allegedly cultivated relationships with KGB personnel who possessed real authority and access to sensitive information about law enforcement activities throughout the region. These officers allegedly provided intelligence about upcoming police operations, planned raids, and investigation targets that allowed the gang to avoid or respond to investigations. More importantly, they offered insights into the political and economic changes that were reshaping Soviet society, giving Tambov leaders advanced knowledge about opportunities and threats that other criminals couldn't anticipate. These weren't casual relationships built on personal friendship or shared criminal interests. They represented what investigators described as a strategic alliance between organized crime and elements within the security apparatus who saw mutual benefit in cooperation that extended beyond simple corruption. The KGB officers involved understood that the collapse of the Soviet system would create new challenges that required different approaches to maintaining order and protecting their own interests. Working with disciplined criminal organizations like Tambov offered them access to capabilities and resources that official government agencies might not be able to provide in the uncertain years ahead. Reporting suggests the KGB connections provided early warning about police operations that allegedly allowed Tambov to avoid arrests and raids that destroyed other criminal organizations. When local police departments planned operations against protection rackets or territorial disputes, gang leaders allegedly received advance notice that let them relocate personnel and evidence before officers arrived. This intelligence advantage meant they could continue operating, while competitors faced constant disruption from law enforcement activity. The advance warnings also allowed them to time their own operations to avoid periods of intense police attention, conducting business during intervals when officers were focused elsewhere. The security service relationships allegedly helped neutralize investigations before they could gather enough evidence for successful prosecutions. KGB contacts provided information about which investigators were assigned to cases involving Tambov activities, what evidence had been collected, and which witnesses might cooperate with authorities. This intelligence allowed gang leaders to address potential problems before they became serious threats. They could influence witnesses, relocate incriminating evidence, and adjust their operations to avoid activities that were attracting investigative attention. The result was that serious criminal investigations against Tambov rarely produced the evidence necessary for successful prosecutions. Among the figures investigators have linked to supporting Tambov's operations was Viktor Ivanov, who reporting strongly suggests had connections that helped the organization control ports and fuel routes. These alleged relationships offered protection from rival gangs who lacked similar connections to state security services. When competing criminal organizations attempted to move into Tambov territory or target their business interests, gang leaders could sometimes arrange for police raids against their competitors at strategically convenient moments. The security service connections provided them with a form of official protection that made rivals reluctant to engage in direct confrontation. In exchange, the Tambov Gang likely provided services that the security services needed but couldn't officially perform themselves during the transition period. As the Soviet system collapsed and new political arrangements emerged, KGB officers faced situations where unofficial capabilities might be more effective than official government action. Tambov could conduct surveillance, apply pressure to uncooperative individuals, or gather information in ways that government agencies couldn't officially authorize. The gang's legitimate business connections also provided cover for security service operations that required private sector cooperation. This relationship gave Tambov leaders confidence to operate more openly than their competitors, knowing they allegedly had powerful allies in the shadows who would protect them from serious consequences. While other criminal organizations remained cautious about attracting attention from law enforcement or government officials, Tambov conducted business with unusual boldness. They could afford to be featured in television investigations, maintain high public profiles, and engage in activities that would have been dangerous for gangs without similar protection. This confidence translated into business advantages because clients and competitors both recognized that Tambov possessed connections that made them safer partners and more dangerous enemies. The alleged state criminal linkages weren't unusual. In the collapsing Soviet system, where traditional boundaries between legal and illegal activity were breaking down throughout society, government officials, police officers, and security service personnel were all scrambling to establish new relationships and income sources as the old system disappeared. Many found that cooperation with organized criminals offered opportunities that legitimate channels couldn't provide. What made the Tambov Gang special was how early and effectively they allegedly established these crucial connections before other criminal organizations understood their importance. However, Kumarin himself denied involvement in various allegations when they surfaced in public sources, maintaining his innocence regarding many of the claims made by investigators and journalists. The alleged KGB relationships provided a foundation of protection that allowed the gang to focus on expansion rather than constantly defending against law enforcement pressure. But their growing success and apparent immunity would soon attract dangerous attention from competitors who had no intention of accepting Tambov's dominance quietly. By 1989, the city saw intense turf wars between Tambov and rival groups such as Malishev's gang, clashes that reshaped control over ports and smuggling routes throughout St. Petersburg. Success in the protection business had attracted attention from competitors who had been operating in the shadows, while Tambov built their television reputation and government connections. Other criminal leaders watched as the Tambov athletes collected tribute from businesses throughout the city, controlled profitable territories, and operated with apparent immunity from serious law enforcement interference. The combination of jealousy, territorial ambition, and genuine fear of being pushed out of the criminal economy created conditions for confrontation that no amount of negotiation could prevent. Malishev's faction, feeling threatened by Tambov's rapid expansion and media prominence, decided that the only way to maintain their territory was through direct confrontation with an organization that seemed to be taking over the entire city. Malishev had been operating protection rackets in St. Petersburg since before the Tambov athletes arrived, building his own network of fighters and business relationships through years of street-level criminal work. He understood that allowing Tambov to continue their expansion would eventually mean the end of his organization's independence. The decision to fight wasn't just about pride or ego. It was about economic survival in a criminal marketplace that appeared to be moving toward consolidation under Tambov control. The conflict wasn't just about money or territory between two gangs. It was about which organization would dominate. St. Petersburg's emerging criminal economy, during the crucial transition period when new rules were being established. The stakes included control over seaports, smuggling routes, and trade networks that generated millions in revenue. Both sides understood that the winner would control not just current business operations, but also the future development of organized crime throughout the region. Neither side could afford to lose because defeat would mean complete elimination from the criminal landscape. An especially intense internal conflict occurred in the early 1990s as various factions competed for dominance within the changing criminal hierarchy. By 1993-1995, internal wars developed in and around the Tambov group itself, creating additional layers of violence and uncertainty that complicated the already dangerous situation. These conflicts involved not just external rivals, but also disputes within criminal organizations about leadership, territory, and business strategies. The violence escalated from intimidation and beatings to systematic attempts to destroy opposing organizations entirely. Gang members who had previously relied on fists and clubs began using firearms and explosives that turned St. Petersburg streets into combat zones. Each violent act demanded an even more extreme response, creating a cycle that neither side could break without admitting defeat. The escalation transformed what had begun as business disputes into warfare that threatened the stability of the entire criminal economy. The police found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and intensity of the violence, often arriving at crime scenes only to find bodies and no witnesses willing to provide information. Local law enforcement agencies had been designed to handle individual crimes and small-scale disturbances, not systematic warfare between well-armed criminal organizations. Officers discovered that traditional investigative methods were useless against gang members who followed military-style operational security protocols. Business owners caught in the middle faced impossible choices about which side to support, knowing that the wrong decision could be fatal to themselves and their families. Entrepreneurs who had been paying protection money to Tambov suddenly found themselves approached by rival representatives demanding loyalty and financial support. Switching sides risked retaliation from their original protectors, while refusing to switch risked immediate violence from the challenging faction. Many business owners tried to remain neutral or pay both sides, but this strategy often resulted in being targeted by both organizations as unreliable partners. The war demonstrated that despite their alleged KGB connections, the Tambov Gang was not invincible and faced real threats to their survival from enemies who were willing to risk everything. The security service relationships that had allegedly protected them from law enforcement investigation couldn't prevent direct attacks from rival criminals who operated outside official channels. Gang members discovered that government connections provided no defense against coordinated assaults on their meeting places or systematic attempts to eliminate their leadership. The conflict exposed weaknesses in Tambov's operational security that their enemies exploited through intelligence gathering and surveillance. Rival organizations studied Tambov's methods, identified their meeting places, and tracked the movements of key personnel with professional dedication. Both sides employed counter-surveillance and counterintelligence techniques that transformed St. Petersburg into a city where criminals operated like competing military forces. The brutal conflict proved that controlling St. Petersburg's criminal economy would require not just business skills and government connections, but also the ability to survive sustained attacks from enemies who possessed similar resources and determination. The war separated criminal organizations that could adapt to military-style confrontation from those that collapsed under pressure they had never anticipated. Success would depend on organizational discipline, tactical flexibility, and the willingness to defend territory against competitors who showed no mercy. The violence reached dangerous levels that threatened to destroy even the most established criminal leaders. By 1994, the accumulated tensions and rivalries had created conditions where a single well-planned attack could change everything. On June 1, 1994, Vladimir Kumarin walked into what should have been a routine meeting, unaware that his enemies had finally found the perfect opportunity to eliminate him. The assassination attempt was carefully planned and executed, representing the culmination of years of rivalry and the best chance his enemies would ever have to destroy the Tambov Gang completely. The attackers had gathered intelligence about his movements and security arrangements with professional precision, understanding that success meant eliminating him before his organization could respond effectively. The attack unfolded with shocking violence that left Kumarin severely wounded and fighting for his life. The assault was brutal enough that Kumarin lost an arm in the attack, injuries that required immediate medical attention and raised serious questions about whether he would survive to lead his organization again. The severity of his wounds demonstrated that his enemies had committed everything to this single attempt, knowing they might not get another opportunity to strike at the heart of the Tambov organization. The assassination attempt left the organization's leadership structure in chaos, with rivals and allies alike wondering if this was the end of Tambov's dominance in St. Petersburg. Subordinates who had depended on Kumarin's leadership found themselves making crucial decisions without guidance from their wounded leader. Business partners questioned whether their agreements with Tambov would remain valid if the organization's structure collapsed. Government contacts who had maintained relationships with Kumarin wondered whether their arrangements would survive a leadership transition. The uncertainty created opportunities for competitors while threatening everything the Tambov Gang had built over the previous 7 years. For weeks after the attempt, uncertainty gripped St. Petersburg's criminal underworld as everyone waited to see whether Kumarin would survive and how the gang would respond to the attack. Hospital security became a crucial concern as both sides prepared for potential follow-up attacks. Gang members maintained constant vigilance while trying to conduct normal business operations. The extended period of uncertainty allowed rumors to spread throughout the criminal community about Kumarin's condition, the organization's stability, and potential succession plans that might reshape the city's criminal landscape. The assassination attempt revealed vulnerabilities in Tambov's security that had developed as the organization became more successful and confident. Kumarin's regular routines and public appearances had created patterns that enemies could study and exploit. The gang's security procedures had been designed to prevent casual violence rather than sophisticated assassination attempts by determined enemies with professional capabilities. The attack demonstrated that their alleged government connections couldn't provide personal protection against enemies who operated outside official channels and were willing to accept significant risks to achieve their goals. Rival organizations began positioning themselves to seize Tambov territory and business interests, sensing that their moment had finally arrived to challenge an organization that had seemed invincible. Competing gangs started approaching businesses that had been under Tambov protection, offering alternative arrangements and suggesting that Kumarin's organization might not be able to fulfill its obligations. Some rivals began recruiting Tambov personnel who might be willing to switch sides if their organization appeared to be collapsing. The attack had created the first real opportunity in years for other criminal groups to expand their operations at Tambov's expense. The wounded leader faced a crucial decision that would determine his organization's future. He could retreat from active leadership, allowing subordinates to manage daily operations while he recovered from his injuries and remained safely away from public exposure. This approach would preserve his life, but might allow competitors to conclude that he had been permanently weakened. Alternatively, he could demonstrate that the attack had only made him more dangerous by returning to active leadership and launching aggressive retaliation against his enemies. This option carried significant personal risks, but would send a clear message about Tambov's resilience and determination. Reports indicate that Kumarin traveled abroad for medical treatment, recovering in Düsseldorf and Switzerland, while his organization struggled to maintain control without his direct leadership. The extended absence created additional uncertainty about whether he would return to active involvement or remain permanently removed from day-to-day operations. During this period, subordinates worked to hold territory and maintain business relationships, while competitors tested their defenses and looked for signs of permanent weakness. What happened next would determine not just Kumarin's personal fate, but the future direction of organized crime in Saint Petersburg and the survival of an organization that had transformed the city's criminal landscape. The response would establish whether the Tambov Gang possessed the institutional strength to survive the loss of its founding leader, or whether the entire organization had been built around a single individual whose removal would cause everything to collapse. By 1995, reports suggest that Kumarin had not only survived, but allegedly retaken substantial control, proving that the Tambov Gang possessed a resilience that their enemies had underestimated. The failed assassination actually strengthened their position by eliminating uncertainty and demonstrating their ability to survive the worst their rivals could inflict. The near-death experience had taught them valuable lessons about security and vulnerability, but it had also revealed something more important about their organization's fundamental structure. The assassination attempt marked a turning point that would reshape how the Tambov Gang approached their operations. Surviving such a coordinated attack proved they had evolved beyond a simple criminal organization dependent on a single leader. The crisis had revealed institutional strengths that would become crucial as they prepared to implement their most ambitious strategy yet. Their survival had demonstrated something more valuable than resilience. It had proven they possessed the organizational depth needed for their next phase of evolution. While other criminal organizations remained focused on traditional rackets, the Tambov Gang was quietly implementing a strategy that would transform them from street-level extortionists into legitimate business operators. Most gangs in Saint Petersburg continued operating the same way they had since the late 1980s, collecting protection money from small businesses, running gambling operations, and engaging in activities that generated immediate cash but offered no long-term growth potential. They thought like criminals who needed quick money to fund their operations and personal lifestyles. Tambov leaders had developed a different perspective entirely, one that looked beyond immediate profit toward building something that could last for decades. The transition from protection rackets to controlling actual enterprises required a completely different set of skills and a long-term vision that few criminal organizations possessed. Running protection rackets meant intimidating business owners and collecting regular payments without much concern for whether those businesses succeeded or failed. Taking control of actual companies meant understanding market competition, supply chains, and regulatory frameworks. It required thinking like business executives rather than criminal enforcers. The skills that made someone effective at collecting protection money were almost completely different from the skills needed to manage a profitable company. Moving into legitimate business meant competing not just with other criminals, but with established companies that had been operating legally for years. Legitimate businesses had access to bank loans, government contracts, established customer relationships, and professional expertise that criminal organizations typically lacked. They operated according to legal frameworks that provided both protection and restrictions that criminals had never needed to understand. Entering this world meant learning to compete using business methods rather than violence and intimidation. Success required offering better products, lower prices, or superior service, rather than simply threatening competitors into submission. The gang began identifying vulnerable businesses that could be acquired through a combination of financial pressure, legal maneuvering, and strategic partnerships. They looked for companies that were struggling financially but had valuable assets, established customer bases, or strategic locations that could be developed. Small manufacturing companies facing bankruptcy became targets for acquisition because they owned equipment and facilities that could be used for both legitimate and illegal operations. Import-export businesses attracted their attention because they provided access to shipping networks that could generate legitimate revenue while offering other opportunities. Rather than simply extorting money from businesses, they started installing their own people in management positions and taking ownership stakes in companies throughout Saint Petersburg. Some members became involved in private security firms and business ownership, developments that investigators later flagged as part of the gang's evolution from street-level crime to corporate influence. This approach required recruiting individuals with business education and professional experience, expanding beyond their traditional base of athletes and street criminals. The gang started seeking out professionals who could help them navigate the complexities of legitimate business operations while remaining trustworthy enough to handle sensitive information. The strategy carried significant risks because acquiring companies exposed them to tax and regulatory scrutiny that traditional criminal activities had avoided, which is why they moved carefully through each transition. Owning legitimate businesses meant filing tax returns, maintaining corporate records, and submitting to government inspections that could reveal connections to illegal activities. The financial investments required to acquire and operate businesses represented much larger sums than traditional criminal activities generated. If their business ventures failed, they would lose money that had been accumulated through years of criminal operations. The exposure to government oversight also created new vulnerabilities that could be exploited by law enforcement agencies. Success in legitimate business would provide not just money but respectability and political influence that pure criminal activity could never achieve. Business ownership gave them legitimate reasons to meet with government officials, participate in trade associations, and engage in political activities that were impossible for known criminals. Some reporting alleges that certain members eventually gained positions in the State Duma or local assemblies, though these claims remain allegations supported by investigative reporting rather than proven facts. Successful business operations created employment for local residents, generated tax revenue for municipal governments, and contributed to economic development that made them valuable community members rather than just criminal threats. The transition also provided them with legal income sources that could be used to justify their wealth and lifestyle without raising questions from tax authorities or law enforcement agencies. Business profits offered legitimate explanations for expensive homes, luxury cars, and international travel that would have been difficult to justify based solely on criminal income. The businesses also provided employment for gang members who needed legitimate occupations to avoid suspicion from police surveillance. Management positions in their companies gave criminal associates legal reasons to meet regularly, travel together, and maintain the communication networks necessary for ongoing operations. By the mid-1990s, the Tambov Gang had successfully evolved from a protection racket into a hybrid organization that operated simultaneously in criminal and legitimate spheres. They had learned to use profits from criminal activities to fund business acquisitions while using legitimate businesses to provide cover for continued criminal operations. This dual existence gave them advantages that purely criminal or purely legitimate organizations couldn't match. They could compete in legal markets while using alternative methods when necessary, creating a flexibility that made them extremely difficult for competitors or law enforcement to counter effectively. The success of this strategy would soon depend on gaining control of one particular company that could serve as the foundation for everything they hoped to build. The Petersburg Fuel Company represented more than just another business acquisition. Formed in September 1994 and administered by the Saint Petersburg City Administration, PTK was the key that would unlock the Tambov Gang's transformation into a major economic force that could compete with the largest corporations in Russia. This wasn't some small gas station chain or minor fuel distributor that they could control through intimidation and street-level tactics. This was a major industrial operation that supplied fuel to factories, government agencies, transportation companies, and heating systems throughout the St. Petersburg region. Controlling PTK meant managing an enterprise that touched nearly every aspect of the city's economic life. When Vladimir Kumarin became deputy president of PTK from 1998 to 1999, it marked the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan to gain control of a strategic industry that had taken years to execute. The appointment wasn't the result of a hostile takeover or criminal intimidation campaign against the company's previous management. Instead, it represented the successful completion of a complex process that had involved building relationships with existing shareholders, demonstrating business competence and positioning himself as the logical choice for a leadership role. Kumarin had spent months learning about fuel distribution operations, studying industry regulations, and developing the expertise necessary to manage a legitimate energy company. Investigators and some officials later alleged the gang used PTK to expand control over fuel trading, claims that became widely reported though contested in court during later probes. The acquisition process had required skills that went far beyond anything the gang had needed for their earlier business ventures. Taking control of PTK meant understanding petroleum markets, supply chain logistics, regulatory compliance, and industrial customer relationships that were completely different from the small businesses they had previously acquired. They needed to demonstrate financial capability, management expertise, and strategic vision that would convince existing shareholders and business partners that they could operate the company more effectively than previous management. Alleged control over fuel distribution in Saint Petersburg meant managing complex operations that connected Russian oil refineries with thousands of individual customers throughout the region. PTK's operations gave the gang access to transportation networks and municipal contracts that could serve multiple purposes. The fuel business provided legitimate cash flow that could be used to fund other acquisitions and investments without raising suspicions about the source of capital among bank officials or tax authorities. PTK generated millions of rubles in monthly revenue through normal business operations that created legal income streams far larger than their traditional criminal activities had produced. This legitimate income could be used to purchase additional businesses, invest in new ventures, or fund expansion projects without triggering investigations into the source of their capital. The company's government contracts created opportunities to build relationships with municipal officials and demonstrate their value as reliable business partners who contributed to the city's economic development. PTK supplied fuel to city buses, government buildings, and public facilities. That made them essential service providers rather than criminal threats. These relationships gave gang leaders legitimate reasons to meet with mayors, city council members, and bureaucrats who controlled permits, contracts, and regulatory decisions that affected their operations. Success in fulfilling government contracts proved their competence and reliability in ways that traditional criminal activities never could. Managing a legitimate fuel company required developing expertise in areas like logistics, finance, and regulatory compliance that enhanced their overall capabilities as business operators. Gang members learned to read financial statements, understand petroleum market fluctuations, manage employee relations, and navigate complex regulatory requirements that governed fuel storage and distribution. These skills transferred to other business ventures and made them more effective at identifying acquisition targets, evaluating investment opportunities, and managing diverse business portfolios. The education they received through operating PTK transformed them from criminal enforcers into business executives with professional capabilities. The success of PTK proved that the Tambov Gang could operate major enterprises as effectively as any legitimate business organization in Saint Petersburg. The company maintained profitability, satisfied customer requirements, met regulatory obligations, and competed successfully against other fuel distributors without relying on criminal methods or intimidation tactics. Their business performance demonstrated that they possessed the management skills, technical knowledge, and strategic thinking necessary to succeed in legitimate markets through superior service and competitive pricing rather than criminal coercion. Through PTK, the gang demonstrated that they had successfully crossed the line from criminal organization to business empire, with criminal origins that could operate in both worlds simultaneously. The fuel company became the template for an expansion strategy that would eventually give them control over dozens of enterprises across multiple industries throughout the Saint Petersburg region. Owning PTK helped them blend legal revenue with other activities, creating a foundation that supported everything they hoped to build. But business success alone wasn't enough to secure their long-term survival and growth. The fuel company had taught them valuable lessons about operating in legitimate markets, but it had also revealed that economic power without political protection remained vulnerable to government interference and regulatory pressure. They needed something more than business relationships and municipal contracts to guarantee their continued expansion. The solution lay in direct political influence that could shape laws, regulations, and government decisions affecting their operations. By the late 1990s, the Tambov Gang had discovered that true power in post-Soviet Russia required more than business success. They had learned through experience that owning successful businesses and maintaining relationships with bureaucrats wasn't enough to guarantee long-term security. Political power required having allies inside the system, making decisions that protected their interests while appearing to serve the public good. Investigations and reporting later linked some associates to legislative roles or political influence, though legal outcomes remained mixed regarding these allegations. This wasn't described as a casual effort to buy influence through campaign contributions or lobbying activities. Sources suggested they developed a comprehensive strategy for identifying potential candidates, funding their campaigns, and ensuring their loyalty once elected to office. The approach required understanding electoral processes, voter preferences, and media management in ways that criminal organizations had never needed to master. The selection process for political candidates allegedly involved careful evaluation of individuals who possessed both electoral viability and personal characteristics that made them suitable for cooperation. Ideal candidates needed public speaking abilities, educational backgrounds that would appeal to voters, and personal histories that could withstand media scrutiny and opposition research. They also needed psychological profiles that indicated they would maintain loyalty to the organization while serving in public office. Finding people who met both sets of requirements proved challenging, because most qualified candidates preferred to maintain their independence rather than serve criminal interests. Political infiltration was far more complex than business acquisition, because it required public campaigns, media scrutiny, and the ability to function in legitimate political processes that operated according to democratic principles. Business acquisitions could be completed through private negotiations, financial pressure, or discreet arrangements that remained hidden from public view. Political campaigns involved public speeches, media interviews, voter interactions, and opposition research that exposed candidates to scrutiny from journalists, competitors, and law enforcement agencies who might recognize connections to organized crime. Campaign management required skills that the gang had never needed for their business or criminal operations. They learned to conduct opinion polling, develop messaging strategies, organize volunteer networks, and coordinate media appearances that would appeal to voters without revealing their true loyalties. The campaigns also required significant financial investments that had to be structured carefully to avoid violating election laws or creating paper trails that could expose their involvement. Success meant managing complex operations that involved dozens of people, while maintaining operational security that protected the organization's interests. Having alleged associates in elected positions would have provided insider information about upcoming legislation, regulatory changes, and government contracts that gave them significant advantages over competitors who lacked similar connections. Legislative assemblies discussed proposed laws months before they were enacted, providing early warning about changes that could affect business operations, criminal activities, or law enforcement priorities. Committee meetings revealed government priorities, budget allocations, and regulatory initiatives that created both opportunities and threats for their various enterprises. Political connections also offered potential protection from law enforcement, investigations, and the ability to influence prosecutorial decisions through legislative pressure or budgetary control. Elected officials possessed legitimate authority to request information about ongoing investigations, question law enforcement priorities, and influence funding decisions that affected police operations. They could raise questions about specific cases during public hearings, suggest that resources should be redirected toward different priorities, or create political pressure that discouraged aggressive prosecution of their associates. The strategy required identifying candidates who could win elections while maintaining loyalty to the organization's interests throughout their political careers. Electoral success demanded candidates who could appeal to ordinary voters through popular positions on local issues, economic development, and public safety concerns. These same individuals needed to maintain secret relationships with criminal associates while serving in positions that required public accountability and ethical behavior. The contradiction between public service and private loyalty created ongoing tensions that required careful management. Political operatives needed training in legislative procedures, parliamentary rules, and governmental processes that enabled them to function effectively in their official roles while serving the organization's interests. They learned to draft legislation, participate in committee hearings, negotiate with other officials, and manage constituent relationships that were essential parts of their public responsibilities. At the same time, they maintained communication channels with gang leadership, provided intelligence about government activities, and influenced decisions that benefited the organization's operations. The Spanish probe later named some officials as connected to the organization, though many were subsequently acquitted. Some accused figures were detained in 2008 operations, while a 2018 Spanish court acquitted 17 defendants in the Troika case, illustrating the complex legal outcomes surrounding these allegations. These mixed results demonstrated the difficulty of proving political infiltration cases, while highlighting the scope of international investigations into their activities. Their alleged political operations required sophistication, long-term planning, and professional capabilities that most criminal organizations never developed. The ability to potentially place associates in elected positions proved they had mastered complex forms of institutional infiltration. Political ties would have provided crucial advantages for their business model through access to permits, contracts, and regulatory cover that protected their expanding operations. The infiltration of political institutions represented the final step in the Tambov Gang's transformation from street criminals to power brokers, with influence at multiple levels of government. With business control and political influence secured, they were positioned to expand their operations far beyond Saint Petersburg's borders into networks that would span continents. Their expanding influence created opportunities for financial operations that would dwarf anything they had accomplished within Russia's borders. As the new millennium began, investigations alleged the Tambov Gang was moving funds through international networks that spanned multiple continents, with prosecutors claiming amounts ranging from tens of millions up to over 1 billion euros in different cases. What had started as a regional protection racket in Saint Petersburg had evolved into a global financial operation that rivaled the complexity of multinational corporations. Their money moved through banking systems in dozens of countries, flowed through corporate structures that existed only on paper, and disappeared into investment vehicles that made tracking the funds nearly impossible for law enforcement agencies that operated within single national boundaries. The gang's alleged money laundering operations involved shell companies, offshore trusts, and multi-jurisdictional transfers that created a global financial web investigators described as nearly impossible to trace. Each jurisdiction offered different advantages for hiding money and obscuring ownership. Panama provided corporate secrecy laws that prevented authorities from identifying real company owners. Liechtenstein offered banking privacy that protected account holders from foreign investigations. Cyprus served as a gateway between European and Russian financial systems that allowed funds to move between regions without triggering reporting requirements. The UAE provided access to Middle Eastern markets and investment opportunities that created legitimate explanations for large financial transfers. Bulgarian investigators discovered one alleged route where Optima in Bulgaria reportedly wired half of its funds to Estonian AS Tavid, demonstrating the complex international pathways these operations allegedly used. These weren't simple bank accounts opened under false names. The Tambov financial network allegedly involved layers of corporate entities that created multiple degrees of separation between the organization and its money. A single transaction might pass through 6 different countries and a dozen different corporate entities before reaching its final destination. Each step in the process created legal barriers that made it more difficult for investigators to trace the money's origins or identify the people who controlled it. Operating internationally meant navigating different legal systems, banking regulations, and law enforcement agencies, while maintaining the secrecy essential to their success. Each country had its own banking laws, corporate registration requirements, and international cooperation agreements that created both opportunities and obstacles for money laundering operations. The gang needed legal expertise in multiple jurisdictions to structure transactions that complied with local regulations while avoiding reporting requirements that could expose their activities. They also needed to understand which countries had strong law enforcement cooperation agreements and which maintained banking secrecy that protected their operations. Managing international operations required a level of professional expertise that went far beyond traditional criminal capabilities. The gang employed lawyers, accountants, and financial specialists who understood international banking regulations, tax laws, and corporate structures in multiple countries. These professionals needed to create transaction patterns that appeared legitimate to banking compliance officers while actually serving criminal purposes. They structured deals that looked like normal business activities to regulatory authorities who might review suspicious transaction reports from international banks. The Spanish Troika investigation revealed the enormous scale of their alleged operations, with prosecutors claiming connections to Russian political and security elites who had used Tambov's financial networks for their own purposes. Spanish authorities discovered that what they initially thought was a single money laundering case actually involved a massive international operation that allegedly processed funds for numerous Russian officials and businessmen. The investigation revealed transaction patterns that suggested coordination between organized crime groups and government officials at the highest levels of Russian society. Prosecutors found evidence that the Tambov network had allegedly been used to move money belonging to politicians, security service officers, and business executives who needed to hide wealth from both Russian authorities and international investigators. Bulgarian and Estonian investigations uncovered evidence of alleged transfers involving more than €1 billion, flowing through shell companies and cross-border transfers that connected Saint Petersburg with financial centers throughout Europe. The Estonian investigation focused on banking activities that had processed hundreds of millions of euros through accounts that appeared to serve no legitimate business purpose. Bulgarian authorities discovered real estate purchases, business, investments and financial transfers that created a paper trail leading back to Tambov-controlled companies. The scale of these alleged operations demonstrated that the gang had become a major player in European money laundering networks that served clients throughout the former Soviet Union. The international operations allegedly provided not just money, laundering services, but also opportunities for arms trafficking, drug smuggling, and other criminal enterprises that required global transportation and financial networks. The same corporate structures and banking relationships that moved dirty money could also facilitate international smuggling operations. Shipping companies controlled by Tambov associates could transport weapons and drugs along with legitimate cargo. Financial networks that laundered criminal profits could also process payments for international arms deals and drug transactions that connected suppliers in one country with buyers in another. The global reach of their alleged operations demonstrated how successfully they had adapted to the opportunities created by economic globalization that had connected financial systems worldwide after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The same technologies and regulatory changes that made legitimate international business easier also created opportunities for sophisticated criminal organizations to operate across borders with unprecedented freedom and complexity. The international investigations revealed that the Tambov Gang had allegedly become more than a Russian criminal organization. They were now a transnational business network with criminal origins that could compete with legitimate multinational corporations. However, their success had also made them a target for law enforcement agencies around the world who were beginning to understand the scope of their operations. But their most important source of power wasn't hidden in offshore accounts or international corporate structures. It was anchored in concrete infrastructure that no amount of financial complexity could replace. The key to understanding the Tambov Gang's lasting power lies in a simple geographic fact that had shaped St. Petersburg's importance for centuries. St. Petersburg is Russia's window to Europe, and government officials publicly warned that Tambov's influence extended to multiple ports, a claim that investigators later investigated. While other criminal organizations focused on local territories or specific criminal enterprises, Tambov understood that controlling maritime infrastructure meant controlling the flow of goods, money and information between Russia and the rest of the world. This strategic insight separated them from every other criminal group operating in the region. In 2001, Interior Minister Boris Gryzlov made an official statement that Tambov controlled up to 100 industrial enterprises, including PTK and 4 main ports: St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, Arkhangelsk, and Murmansk. This wasn't an accusation or speculation from law enforcement agencies. It was an official government acknowledgement that a criminal organization had allegedly achieved control over critical national infrastructure. The announcement revealed that Tambov's influence extended far beyond St. Petersburg city limits to encompass the entire regional transportation network that connected Russia with Scandinavian countries, Germany, and other European trading partners. The 4 ports under their alleged control included facilities that handled everything from raw materials and manufactured goods to passenger ferries and commercial shipping operations. Each port served different segments of the maritime economy, creating multiple revenue streams and operational opportunities that enhanced their overall strategic position. Container terminals processed manufactured goods moving between Russian factories and European consumers. Bulk cargo facilities handled raw materials like timber, metals, and petroleum products that formed the backbone of Russia's export economy. Passenger terminals served ferry routes that connected St. Petersburg with Helsinki, Stockholm, and other European cities. Port control meant managing not just criminal enterprises, but legitimate international trade worth billions of dollars. Annually, that required sophisticated coordination with government agencies, international shipping companies, and commercial customers throughout Europe. The ports operated according to complex schedules that involved customs inspections, cargo, loading operations, and coordination with railroad networks that brought goods from throughout Russia to St. Petersburg for export. Managing these operations required expertise in international shipping regulations, customs procedures, and logistics coordination that went far beyond traditional criminal capabilities. Their port operations allegedly provided opportunities for smuggling and customs fraud, while also generating legitimate revenue from shipping and logistics services that made them valuable partners for legal businesses. The same facilities that processed legitimate cargo could potentially handle contraband shipments without attracting attention from customs officials who were accustomed to seeing Tambov personnel in operational roles. Port workers who were loyal to the organization could identify valuable cargo shipments or report on law enforcement activities that might threaten operations. The ports gave them access to international shipping networks that could be used to transport contraband across borders, using the same routes and methods employed for legitimate commerce. Container ships that carried legal manufactured goods could also transport hidden compartments. The regular schedules and established relationships between Russian ports and European destinations created cover for shipments that would have been difficult to arrange through other transportation methods. Control over port facilities also meant influence over the thousands of workers, truckers, and business operators who depended on maritime trade for their livelihoods throughout the northwestern region. Dock workers, crane operators, security guards, and administrative personnel all understood that their employment depended on maintaining good relationships with the organization that allegedly controlled their workplace. Trucking companies that transported goods between ports and inland destinations needed cooperation to operate efficiently. Shipping agents, customs brokers, and logistics companies that served international customers required cooperation from port management to conduct their business operations. The strategic importance of the ports made them valuable to both criminal organizations and legitimate businesses, creating opportunities for cooperation and conflict that extended throughout the regional economy. Government officials understood that the ports generated tax revenue, employment opportunities, and international trade relationships that were essential for the region's economic development. Business leaders needed reliable port services to maintain their relationships with international customers and suppliers. This created a situation where alleged criminal control over port facilities was tolerated, or even supported by people who would normally oppose organized crime activities. Port control represented the perfect fusion of their criminal origins, with legitimate business operations providing both legal and illegal revenue streams that reinforced their overall economic and political power. The ports generated legitimate income through normal shipping and logistics operations that could be used to fund other business ventures and political activities. At the same time, the criminal opportunities provided by port control created additional revenue that enhanced their ability to maintain control over legitimate operations. This combination made them nearly impossible to dislodge through either law enforcement action or business competition. The ports became the foundation of their lasting power because they controlled infrastructure that was essential to Russia's economy and couldn't easily be replaced or bypassed by government authorities or competing organizations. Unlike other criminal enterprises that could be disrupted through arrests or territorial disputes, port control involved physical infrastructure, established business relationships, and operational expertise that had been developed over many years. Replacing Tambov's alleged role in port operations would have required massive government investment, disruption of international trade relationships, and coordination between multiple agencies that had become accustomed to working with their organization. Even as individual leaders faced prosecution, the organization's alleged control over these strategic assets ensured their continued influence in Saint Petersburg's economy. The ports continued operating regardless of leadership changes within the organization, creating institutional continuity that survived individual arrests or prosecutions that might have destroyed other criminal enterprises. This transformation, from street-level criminals to controllers of critical infrastructure, represented something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. Their influence over these strategic assets demonstrated how criminal organizations could evolve beyond traditional boundaries to become permanent fixtures in a nation's economic infrastructure. The Tambov Gang's transformation from a group of provincial athletes to Russia's most sophisticated criminal business hybrid reveals how organized crime adapted to post-Soviet opportunities by becoming indistinguishable from legitimate power. They understood something that other criminal organizations missed entirely. Success required more than street violence and intimidation tactics. Their success came not from being better criminals, but from understanding that true power in the new Russia required mastering both the criminal underworld and the legitimate worlds of business and politics. The legal outcomes reflect this complexity. Vladimir Kumarin was later convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, while the major Spanish Troika trial resulted in acquittals for many defendants in 2018. The Tambov story illustrates how, in the 1990s-2000s, some criminal groups adapted by fusing business, politics, and geography, creating a hybridization that remains a complex, partially proven and partially alleged historical feature rather than a simple headline. If you found this quietly curious story helpful for winding down, consider subscribing.